That's it.
I think we got it.
We found the quest.
All right.
The Royal Canadian Geographical Society organized the Shackleton Quest Expedition in order to find the last expedition ship of Sir Ernest Shackleton, the ship that Shackleton died on. And I'm very happy to say that we found that ship. It's lying in 390 meters of water in the Labrador Sea.
That's RCGS CEO John Geiger and his team at the moment of discovery of Quest, the last ship of legendary polar explorer Ernest Shackleton. John Geiger is our guest, telling the story of the epic hunt for Quest and the legacy of Shackleton on this episode of Explore, a Canadian Geographic podcast. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. I'm your host, David McGuffin, and it's a great week for explorers and exploration. Last week, on the rolling seas off Labrador, the RCGS Shackleton Quest Expedition made an amazing discovery. An historic moment for the Society and for the story of Ernest Shackleton, one of the world's greatest explorers. In this episode, John Geiger gives us an edge-of-your-seat, blow-by-blow description of the open sea hunt for Quest, as mechanical failures and setbacks saw the expedition almost abandoned just as Quest was discovered. Geiger, also a best-selling author who's written extensively about Shackleton, also talks about the man that inspired the Quest hunt and his well-deserved fame as an explorer and inspirational leader. John's crewmates on this voyage included the world-famous shipwreck hunter David Mern, RCGS fellow and geographer Antoine Normandin, and RCGS explorer in residence and legendary diver Jill Heinerth. The expedition's honorary patrons included Shackleton's granddaughter and the traditional chief of the Miabuget First Nation, on whose territory the wreck was found. This is a sea story worthy of the rugged waters that it sailed through, so let's cast off and get to it. John Geiger, welcome to the Explore podcast.
Thanks very much, David. Great to be here.
And what a great reason to have you here. Such an exciting moment. If I'm correct, you're the one that first saw Quest on the ocean floor. Is that right? What was that moment like?
You know, we'd all been looking at the monitor on and off during the course of this 17 hours that we were sort of mowing the lawn, going over this high probability area that we had identified as possible site for the wreck. I was, during that 17 hours, I'd gone for a nap at one stage. I'd also gone to the mess and eaten. And I, was running around doing all sorts of things. And it was only, I think, a freak coincidence at the moment that the Quest appeared on the monitor. I happened to be the one looking at it in the lab where we were operating the sonar out of. So, I just said, like, what's that? And then it was like, that's it, So it was just very surprised. It had been in quite a monotonous period. We'd first of all had a couple of days of sort of challenges, like our hydraulic winch wasn't working properly, so we couldn't very well deploy the side scan sonar without getting it back. So we had to have a way to reel it back in. The winch was not working. We had to then turn around and go to this small community in northern Newfoundland called St. Anthony. Luckily, a wonderful guy named Harvey, who works at a local car shop there, had managed to come out and he fixed it very quickly. But, we lost close to 2 days of a very limited search window that we had. So I was quite concerned about it. And then to, have had those 17 hours of searching without seeing much of anything, to be honest with you. The sonar showed a very smooth, kind of almost scoured, I would say, bottom of the Labrador Sea. There was no interesting geology to speak of. There was nothing else of interest. Occasionally there'd be some little anomaly, and usually it would be identified as a boulder or rock or something, So when Quest appeared, David Marin said, look, when you see it, you'll know it. You'll know it's a shipwreck. You're not going to be mistaking it for something else. And sure enough, the moment it appeared, it just took a second to register that was it.
Tell us a bit about the expedition itself, like who was leading it? What was the germ behind the idea for it?
Well, I was leading it. It was a Royal Canadian Geographical Society expedition, the Shackleton Quest Expedition. I have been thinking about this for something like 6 years. I came across, and I like many people, I'm sort of fascinated by the leadership and the example and the exploration work of Sir Ernest Shackleton. So I actually was lucky enough in the early 2000s to go to Antarctica and also to visit South Georgia, the island that Shackleton's buried on. So that's when I really started to get kind of interested in Sir Ernest, and like many people have done, start to read up on Shackleton and whatnot. And at one point, one of the biographies made sort of passing reference, literally only in a sentence or two, that he had planned to lead a Canadian Arctic expedition just prior to his final quest expedition. So that really interested me, and I began to do more reading on that subject. Read a number of books on it that touched on it, delved into it in a little more detail, and to me it was just I love these sort of Canadian connections to great figures. The story is actually very interesting, to the point that I started researching, a manuscript, a book which I was working on during the pandemic about this period of Shackleton's interest in the Canadian Arctic. He traveled extensively in Canada. He was in Ottawa, stayed at the Chateau Laurier. He was in Toronto and met with members of the Eaton family. He's very engaged, and he was very keen on a Canadian Arctic expedition. There was a sense that there were some undiscovered islands, possibly even undiscovered continent in what's now known to be the Arctic Ocean, with no islands or no continent to be found, but there was that belief that there might be, and it was an area that was completely unexplored, and so that was Shackleton purchased Quest for that Canadian Arctic expedition. Quest is a Norwegian vessel, had been built as a sealing vessel, or for basic commercial purposes in the North and Arctic and subarctic. So it was a vessel very well suited for that kind of work. When his dream of this Canadian expedition was thwarted, and he had a kind of a last minute telegram from the then Prime Minister Arthur Meehan saying this wasn't going to happen. So at that point, he didn't have much choice. He had purchased the ship. He had outfitted it. He had a crew, many of which were veterans of his earlier endurance expeditions. So some really remarkable people that he was planning to take with him, including a Canadian and an Aussie. So it was it was all set to go. He ended up diverting to a kind of a fallback plan that he had in his back pocket, and this was what was called the Shackleton Rowett expedition in 1921. It was backed by a gentleman named John Rowett, an Englishman who he'd been at school with in what we would call high school, I guess, at Dulwich College in London. And so they knew each other, and they had to come across each other a number of times, in their careers. And, Rowett stepped in, provided the funding for this expedition that was to explore Enderby Quadrant of Antarctica, and also look at the, for some sub-Antarctic islands and explore, looking for others and visiting some that were known. So that was sort of the goal. They headed off. Quest was not terribly well suited for the Atlantic and the Southern Ocean in particular. They had all sorts of mechanical problems. It turned out the steam engine was a lot older than the ship itself. The Quest was built in 1917, but the engine was in the late 19th century. So it was causing grief. They did about a month's worth of repairs in Rio. And while there, Shackleton had what appeared to have been a minor heart attack, although he kind of brushed it off. It seemed to be very serious, but he recovered, and he told everyone to quit worrying and, onward. And then they sailed for South Georgia, and that's where, the remarkable Ernest Shackleton story came to a tragic end.
It was a heart attack at the end. It took his life, yeah?
Well, that's right. In the final couple of days, Quest was cruising along the coastline of South Georgia, this British possession, some Antarctic, island. And he was remembering, his amazing escape from Antarctica over that uncharted mountain range there, and then to the Stromness, where there was a whaling station where he was able to then be rescued and secure the rescue ultimately of all the men on Endurance. So he was remembering that, and with some of the other Endurance veterans. Then they went to Grytviken community, sort of at the edge of South Georgia, and he went ashore briefly and came back and wrote a beautiful kind of poetic entry in his journal, which was quite sparse. He didn't really attend to his journal on this expedition, but near the end he began writing again, and he described it as such a strange place, and wrote that a star hung gem-like above the bay, and this quite romantic.
Poetic almost. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And he had that sense of poetry about him. He was, he was a fascinating guy, very different from any other explorers of that era. He was a, self-made explorer. He was, very entrepreneurial, very charismatic, had really, at the time, very modern views of leadership. He had this kind of romantic streak in him that surfaced in his writing. Lovely turns of phrase and poetic touch often. And so then that, that evening, he died early on the 5th of January, 1922, and called out for some assistance. He asked for a painkiller. He was attended to briefly, and very brief exchange, and then massive heart attack apparently, and died.
Wow. So the story of Quest, the ship itself, continues on, though, doesn't it? Where does Quest go from there?
You're right. I mean, first of all, the death of Shackleton really marked the end of the so-called heroic age of polar exploration, and things were already in flux, and there was already change afoot. But with his death and subsequently the end of that expedition, it became known that the mechanical age of polar exploration began. Where aircraft were involved, mechanical devices were deployed, and so forth. So it did mark kind of a watershed moment, and Quest was, the place that change, the vessel really for that change. It really is a fascinating ship for that reason. Frank Wild and the rest of the crews continued. They felt that the boss, as they called him, would want them to carry on, so they did. But they didn't achieve a great deal on in the subsequent months, and they returned to London, and that was the end of the Shackleton Road expedition. But as you say, it wasn't the end of Quest, and the ship was sold in 1923 to a Norwegian family. A company purchased it, and then they used it for a whole bunch of really interesting purposes over the years, including it was the expedition platform for Gino Watkins, a really interesting young English explorer who led the British Arctic air route expedition that was looking. They visited eastern Greenland and established camps along there, even on the Greenlandic ice cap. And we're taking weather and readings and other measurements in the theory that there would be an air route established over Greenland connecting the United Kingdom with Canada. So Winnipeg, in fact. So it was, it was viewed as this Greenland as a staging area for transatlantic flights, which of course were coming. And that was quite a significant expedition. Collected a lot of science, did a lot of work. But tragically, Gino Watkins himself died, not aboard Quest, but died, shortly thereafter on Greenland. So at age 25, another notable explorer associated with Quest perished. Quest then, it continues. It became involved in the search for Roald Amundsen, the great Norwegian explorer, when he disappeared in the Arctic. So there's this whole series of really interesting Arctic episodes that are tied to the vessel as well. In between these various expedition roles, was involved in sealing. In fact, there was a book, an account of Quest and the men aboard Quest as sealers published. So it was quite a storied ship and has this amazing kind of pedigree. First in the water in 1917, and as you know, it ended in the water in 1962 off the coast of Labrador, the Labrador Sea.
So how did it wind up there? Like, what was that final journey?
That was a sealing endeavor. There was a flotilla of Norwegian sealing vessels there in the vicinity. They encountered the ice flows, and that's where you'd find seals. So it would make sense that they would nose their way into that kind of environment. Quest, it was a bit long in the tooth at that stage, obviously, and it got sort of caught in the ice. The ice pressure damaged the hull. They were not really aware of the extent of the damage while they were in the ice. It was only when the ice began to kind of recede that suddenly water started to come in. They had pumps, but the pumps were overwhelmed by the leaks. In the end, they had to abandon ship, and luckily other sealing vessels were in the vicinity. and they came over and rescued the crew, so there were no fatalities at its end. And there was some photography of it going down, so we have actual images of it sinking.
We should talk about Shackleton too, because he's someone I know you've written about in your book, The Third Man Factor, and you're one of the jurors for the Shackleton Medal. You have a real connection to the man himself. For people who aren't completely familiar with his story, what is it that's for you compelling about Ernest Shackleton?
Part of it I alluded to earlier. He was sort of a self-made explorer. He didn't come up through the normal route. Like you see someone like Robert Falcon Scott, who, was a Royal Navy officer, come through up through the ranks of the Royal Navy. I mean, Sir John Franklin, a much earlier explorer, Royal Navy. George Nares, another explorer of the Canadian Arctic, Royal Navy. So many of them were Royal Navy officers, and it was he sort of broke the mold. Even the early Antarctic exploration, someone like James Clark Ross, Royal Navy officer. So Shackleton he was a bit different. He had a funny affinity with the rather dour Roald Amundsen, who was a Norwegian explorer who was the first through the Northwest Passage to sail through the Northwest Passage, and he was also, as you know, I'm sure, the first to reach the South Pole. Very different personalities, but they shared a real respect for one another. And that maybe partly because, in a way, Amundsen was self-made too. That was part of who Shackleton was. And he was in it kind of for the adventure. A lot of that period of exploration later is kind of dressed up as being, quote, science, end quote. But, while they undertook scientific work, for Shackleton, it was the adventure of it, I think. He really loved the adventure of it, the adventure of exploration and discovery. And he could communicate that. His accounts, his lectures, he was a formidable public speaker, and he just had the audience always kind of in the palm of his hand, during his talks. So there's that side to it. But ultimately, I think what's most exceptional about Shackleton was his humanity. He was somebody who actually cared about other people. So you compare him with someone like Gilles Thomas Stephenson, the Canadian-American explorer who, lost scores of people on his expeditions. Here's a guy who, unlike, for example, Robert Falcon Scott, when Shackleton had a party headed to the South Pole, he was within about 97 miles or something of the South Pole. He realized that if he pushed on to reach the South Pole, that probably at least a couple members of his party would have died. I think that's beyond a doubt. So what did he do? Well, we know what Scott did. Scott pushed on,
Right.
And he didn't. Of course, we know he wasn't the first in the end anyway. But we also know that Scott and everyone in his party died on the return journey. Shackleton turned around. He had established the furthest south. He'd gotten the closest to the South Pole any human had ever been. But he turned around and he got his people out. And of course, the most famous example of that is the Endurance Expedition, where, he had this very grandiose plan. Once Amundsen and Scott, although of course Scott died, as I say, on the return journey, but after they had already been to the South Pole, suddenly the South Pole wasn't as alluring as a destination for an explorer. He had this idea he called it the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, crossing the Antarctic continent for the first time. But that was the so-called Endurance Expedition. And of course, we know the story. Endurance gets trapped in ice in the Weddell Sea after being held in the ice for extended period. It's damaged, kind of fatally by the ice pressure, and they lose their ship. So at one point, Shackleton says something to the effect of, ship has gone, stores have gone, so now we go home, And he manages to get this whole group, there's 28 of them, he manages to get them out. They build a camp on the ice. They then head to this place called Elephant Island using the small boats that they dragged, off the vessel. They ended up having to eat their dogs. Their sled dogs had been taken for the Antarctic journey. They did everything they could to survive it. And it's just a miraculous story of survival and leadership, how to keep people who are panicking calm, how to keep their morale up. He always put their safety ahead of basically everything. And he succeeded. He was able to get all the men of Quest out alive. And this miraculous journey across, he took a small group of them in one of the boats. He himself went with them, took some incredible risks, reached South Georgia in the midst of a hurricane, then wrong side of the island, they suddenly have to become mountain climbers. They're all dehydrated, starving. They're not climbers, but they end up climbing over this mountain range and finally reaching Stromness and this whaling stations, and contrive to save, everybody on Endurance. So, an incredible survival story. The lessons he taught during that and during all of those expeditions. One point in South, he writes, patience, patience, patience. Learning to be patient, not to make rash decisions. And there was no job that was kind of beneath him as a commander. He was prepared to do anything, he wasn't some sort of sitting up in some special, loft and letting everyone else do all the heavy lifting. He was always right in there. Really, really remarkable guy. And of course, that sense of, the word endurance really is very apt for his vessel, because he had that ability to endure.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that story is taught in business schools now as leadership.
Oh, absolutely. Harvard, I think that as a course, and there's been numerous books written about the Shackleton way of leadership.
So who are the other members of the team for this quest expedition that deserve a shout out? Well,
everyone. It was a real amazing group effort. First of all, we had, a number of philanthropists who had the vision to support us. And, this is not the kind of project that RCGS has a budget for itself. And we count on people to help us. And among them, I found very moving was the Eden, members of the Eden family got behind us and sort of restored a family connection with Sir Ernest, dating back to, time he spent in Toronto. It was the support of these philanthropists that helped us get project underway. And there were two real critical team members in terms of our ability to kind of, first of all, establish where to look, where to go. Antoine Normandin, who is, a young geographer and transportation planner from Ottawa, just did an incredible amount of work. He was our lead researcher, and he was deputy search director for the expedition. He and I went to Norway. We met up with Geir Clover, the director of the Fram Museum, the foremost polar museum on the planet. Really, it's got two ships that are incredibly important in the history of polar exploration, the Fram and the Joa. I engaged Geir Clover, and who's also a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and doing research in Norway. Through him, we met Tore Top, whose family owned Quest those years.
No way. Wow.
Yeah, from 23 to 62, and he has this incredible archive, including these photos of it sinking, the telegram that was sent from the captain to the ownership saying the ship had been lost and coordinates of where it went down. Those individuals were incredibly important. Antoine just continued to put, I would say, hundreds of volunteer hours into sort of mathematical work around the search block. We were blessed to have the support of the Honorable Alexandra Shackleton, the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Shackleton, who's actually a friend of mine. She's a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society as well. And she connected me to David Mearns, the world-renowned deck hunter who has this astonishing record of success. He's found the oldest shipwreck ever found, the deepest shipwreck ever found, and countless other really famous vessels. Having, David then step in to assist was incredibly important. He became search director, and he's a very busy guy, have lots of demands on him, and does this professionally. But he pitched in as a volunteer from the moment he got involved. The level of kind of professionalism and detail, and he engaged a couple of colleagues of his who are navigation experts. And so, we had this incredible core group of people working on this puzzle. Where might the ship be? Because even though you have the captain's account of where it went down, doesn't mean the ship's going to be right there. And the ship wasn't right at that location. First of all, how was the fix made? Was it celestial? Was it a Loran, fix? How did they figure out the position of where it was when it went down? And then what are the other factors that would have affected it as it was sinking? The tides, the weather conditions, the ice conditions, anything that may have affected where it ended up. And it was all that information together that formed the search block. So, when we went into the field, I think David was telling people he felt that there was 70% chance of a find. So we felt, we had a good shot, but there was certainly no guarantees.
So you now know where it is. Where do we go from here?
Well, we first of all tell the story, and that's what RCGS and Canadian Geographic are so good at. That's what this podcast is about: is telling, is great storytelling, and so we were blessed to have Jill Heinert, our Explorer in Residence, aboard. She's an incredible filmmaker, photographer, as well as being one of the bravest people on our planet who does these incredible cave dives. And we had Alex Pope, who's the editor-in-chief of Canadian Geographic. Well, we had some people with a direct emotional connection too, by the way, not only Tora Top, who had that Norwegian family link, but also, others. Rowett grandson was aboard as well. So we had people who were really invested in the success of this, and a number of key supporters. So it was a great team. Only 23 of us, including the crew of the ship aboard, including 2 sonar kind of experts, technicians from the Marine Institute at Memorial University who partnered with us and supported this work. So big shout out to Memorial University. I mean, the Marine Institute is one of the most important oceanographic institutions in the world, to say nothing of its importance in Canada. And so they brought to bear a lot of their expertise as well. So it was a great group. And so part of what follows to your question is storytelling, probably a documentary film at some point, certainly a great print issue of Canadian Geographic coming out. We've been telling the world. We've had incredible coverage, New York Times, Times of London, As It Happened, you name it, Globe Mail, consecutive days on the front page, unbelievable coverage just all over the USA Today, all over the world. I've seen Norwegian and Spanish and
South China Morning Post, I saw.
Yeah. So it's really been an astonishing, opportunity to talk about Canada, talk about Royal Canadian Geographic Society, what we do, talk about this great hero of the past, Sir Ernest Shackleton. So that's been amazing. But ultimately, yes, we want to get back to the site. We want to properly document the wreck. We want to get photography and video and maybe even, ability to get a lighter scan of it so that we can look at almost a 3-dimensional imagery of it. So there's a lot of work to be done yet. This was only phase 1 of what we always, conceived to be a two-part expedition. So we're already in planning process for, and I think in the fairly near term, being back on site. We now know the exact location of the ship. There's not going to have to be any fussing about. So we can go directly back and then document it. That's the next stage.
Incredible. Well, congratulations, John, to you and all the team. It's an incredible story, an incredible expedition. And I started out by asking you to describe the moment when you saw it. I also love you to describe the feeling you felt when you became sure that this was it.
To be honest with you, I think it was partly relief. We had spent so much time and, in this process, the planning, the effort that had gone into it, that, had we not found it, it would have been extremely disappointing, kind of almost devastating, So I was relieved, but I was also, and I think everyone aboard, we were euphoric. I mean, I had managed to, we had squirreled away a couple bottles of champagne. It's a dry ship, that we were on the Leeway Odyssey, this wonderful little commercial working ship. But we got special dispensation from the owners to take 2 bottles of champagne with us. And the moment, of course, we could, after we had done all the documentation, we could gather of the quest. We did 4 lines over it so that we could get different perspectives of the wreck using sonar. But once that work was done and there's really nothing else to do there, we cracked open the champagne and celebrated. And it was a great moment. I feel really blessed because, I happen to be the expedition leader, but leaders are only as good as the people they surround themselves with. And I can tell you, with people like David and Antoine and Geiger Clover who came and these family members and Jill Heinert, that on it goes, and these experts from the Marine Institute, we couldn't have had a better group of people.
Congratulations again, and thank you so much for coming on the Explore podcast to share this incredible story.
Well, thanks so much, David.
And thanks to all of you for listening. A reminder that a yearly subscription to the award-winning Canadian Geographic magazine, Canada's greatest magazine, is only $28.50 a year, and that gets you 6 print issues and unlimited digital access. It is chock full of amazing and unique articles about this great nation of ours, deep nourishment for your brain. To sign up, go to canadiangeographic.ca/subscribe. We'll be happy that you did. And if you enjoy Explore, please recommend us to a friend, colleague, or family member, and write a nice review where you listen and give us a 5-star review. It all helps. Until next time, when we'll explore again, I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June 10th with the fur brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
And we flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 100